Welcome to Revenge Fire. Get ready for a dramatic story out of Reno, Nevada. I never imagined that a cheap plastic pregnancy test would be the sharp weapon that finally severed the bond with my family. I am Emmer, a 25-year-old warehouse manager who has spent her entire adult life raising 5 children that do not belong to me. I stood frozen in the center of our chaotic living room in Reno while stepping over piles of dirty laundry to watch him. Why sister casually rubbed her stomach. She looked me straight in the eye with a smug grin to announce she was pregnant for the 6th time, even though she had not held a steady job in years. My stomach twisted with a sickening mix of nausea and absolute exhaustion because I knew exactly who was expected to pay for this new addition. I had just finished a grueling 60-hour work week only to come home and realize my sister expected me to sacrifice even more of my life for her irresponsible choices while her boyfriend sat idly on the couch. I finally found the courage to tell her that I was done funding her lifestyle and would not pay her single cent for this new baby. Her expression instantly shifted from smugness to pure rage. She screamed that I was ungrateful and threatened to kick me out on the street if I refused to comply. That specific moment of betrayal was the final straw that pushed me to choose my own survival over her parasitic demands. If you have ever felt like you are carrying the heavy weight of the world while everyone else around you just takes advantage of your hard work, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now to see exactly how I escaped this living hell. At 4 in the morning, the piercing sound of my alarm clock dragged me out of a fitful sleep before the sun had even touched the horizon of Reno. I forced my exhausted body out of bed because I knew that if I did not start the day now, the entire household would collapse into absolute chaos. Before breakfast, I stumbled into the kitchen to begin the daily marathon of preparing 5 separate lunch boxes while stepping over the sticky remnants of a party I never attended. Derek had left a pyramid of empty beer bottles on the counter for me to clean up alongside the dirty dishes from his late-night snacking session. I silently cursed as I scrubbed the dried salsa off the table because I knew he would never lift a finger to clean up his own mess. The morning routine was a calculated military operation that required me to be in 3 places at once to get everyone ready for school on time. I reviewed the math homework for my 10-year-old nephew Caleb while simultaneously trying to braid the hair of my 7-year-old niece Sophie as she ate her cereal. My oldest nephew Justin was the only one who tried to help by gathering the backpacks, but even he looked exhausted from the constant noise in the house. I moved with frantic urgency because I had to leave for the warehouse in less than 30 minutes, or I would be late for my shift. I ran down the hallway to retrieve the diaper bag and paused for a brief second outside the master bedroom where Jada and Derek were sleeping. The door was firmly locked to keep out the noise of their own children, while my 4-year-old nephew Leo screamed in his crib just a few feet away. It filled me with a cold resentment to know that they were sound asleep in a warm bed while I soothed their crying toddler and marshaled their older children out the door. I managed to drop the older kids at the bus stop and the younger ones at daycare before speeding toward the industrial district with my heart pounding in my chest. My shift at the warehouse was grueling, but the physical labor felt easier than the emotional burden waiting for me at home. I received a notification on my phone during my lunch break that made my stomach drop because it was a final warning from the utility company. I drove home in a panic to find a bright red shut-off notice taped humiliatingly to our front door because the electric bill was 3 months overdue. I stood on the porch shaking with anger because I had given Jada $650 last week specifically to prevent this exact situation. I found a crumpled receipt in the overflowing kitchen trash can, which revealed she had spent the entire amount on designer maternity clothes instead of paying the bill. I had no choice but to transfer the money I had painstakingly saved for my next semester of college tuition to the utility company to keep the lights on. The day continued to spiral downward when the high school called me just as I returned to the warehouse floor to finish my shift. My 13-year-old niece Megan had been caught skipping class and getting into a verbal altercation with a teacher, which was completely out of character for her. I had to clock out early and lose vital hours of pay to sit in the principal's office because her mother refused to answer the phone. Megan looked at me with teary eyes and confessed that she acted out because she felt invisible at home. Since Jada really cared about the new baby, I held her hand and promised to do better. Even though I was already drowning in responsibilities that were not mine, I dragged myself through the front door at 7 in the evening to find Derek sitting on the couch watching sports while the kids complained they were hungry. I immediately went to the kitchen to boil water for spaghetti because it was the quickest and cheapest meal I could prepare after such a disastrous day. Jada finally emerged from the bedroom wearing her new clothes and complained that the house was messy despite doing nothing to clean it. We sat down to eat the pasta, but Derek pushed his plate away with a look of pure disgust after taking a single bite. He told me the sauce was bland and asked why I had not prepared steak since he had a specific craving for red meat that evening. I looked at this grown man who had contributed absolutely nothing to the household and felt a surge of rage that nearly made me scream. He had the audacity to demand a premium meal while I had just spent my education fund to keep the lights on for his video games. 3 days after Jada's announcement turned the house into an emotional battlefield. The situation escalated from passive aggression to an organized intervention led by the family matriarch. Ouch! I was folding a mountain of laundry in the living room when a heavy and authoritative knock on the door signaled the arrival of the one person Jada always called for backup. My grandmother, Grandma Lorraine, stood on the porch with her purse clutched tightly against her chest and a look of severe disapproval painted on her face. She did not come to help scrub the filthy floors or cook for her great-grandchildren, but rather to hold court in the living room and judge my lack of financial contribution to Jada's expanding brood. Jada sat next to Grandma Lorraine on the sofa, with a hand resting protectively on her stomach, while Derek lurked in the kitchen doorway like a silent enforcer waiting for his cue. Grandma Lorraine wasted no time in presenting her solution to the family's transportation problem, which apparently involved liquidating my personal assets for the greater good. She looked at me with cold eyes and suggested that I sell my reliable sedan so we could pool the money to put a down payment on a brand new 7-seater van for Jada. I stared at her in disbelief, because that car was my only means of getting to the warehouse and attending my night classes to finish my degree. I tried to explain that I needed my vehicle to maintain the job that paid the household bills, but my logic fell on deaf ears because Grandma Lorraine believed family obligations superseded personal survival. She shook her head in disappointment as if I were a rebellious teenager rather than the only gainfully employed adult in the room. Grandma Lorraine leaned forward with a scowl and delivered the line that was clearly rehearsed before she arrived to guilt me into compliance. Miranda, you are being so selfish. Your sister is carrying a living being inside her, and you only care about keeping a few pennies in that old car. The accusation stung because I had given everything to this family for 3 years, but I refused to let them take my mobility and my only escape route. I stood up to face them and kept my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. That is not selfishness, Grandma. That is my property. I will not sell my future to pay for Jada's wrong choices anymore. The meeting ended in a hostile stalemate with Grandma Lorraine leaving in a huff while muttering about my ingratitude, but the financial violation did not stop at the demand for my car. I went to my room to calm down and decided to check my bank accounts to ensure I had enough money left for gas or paying the utility bill. That was when I noticed a suspicious email notification from a credit monitoring service regarding a hard inquiry on my social security number that I had not authorized. I logged into the portal with a sinking feeling in my chest and discovered a newly opened credit card account that had already maxed out its limit on a high-end baby furniture website. Jada had used my personal information to buy a designer crib and stroller set while I was at work earning money to keep the lights on in her house. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, because this was not just laziness anymore, it was a federal crime committed against her own sister. I felt the walls of the house closing in on me, so I grabbed my keys and drove straight to a small coffee shop on the edge of Reno to meet the only person I could trust. My best friend Tessa was already waiting at a corner table with a look of concern as I slammed the printed bank statement down in front of her. Tessa worked as a paralegal and she reviewed the fraudulent charges with a sharp professional precision that calmed my racing heart. She explained that Jada had committed identity theft and that I had to take immediate action before my credit score was destroyed forever. We sat there for an hour as she guided me through the process of calling the fraud department to freeze my credit and dispute the charges. Tessa looked me in the eyes. I hung up the phone and gave me a warning that sent a chill down my spine. You have to be careful, Miranda. If they dare to steal your identity, once they will do it again. You need a way out right now. I drove back to the house the evening with a knot in my stomach knowing that the war had officially begun. I walked through the front door to find Jada, frantically typing on her phone, because her transaction for the matching changing table had just been declined. She looked up at me with confusion that quickly turned into suspicion when she saw the icy resolve on my face. I walked past her without saying a word, because I knew that saving myself meant I had to stop saving her. Exactly 1 week later, the atmosphere in the house was as tense as a string about to snap because the silence between Jada and me had become suffocating. I rushed home from the warehouse not to start my usual second shift of cooking and cleaning, but to intercept the mail carrier, because I was expecting a response that could redefine my entire future. I found a thick white envelope stamped with the logo of the largest technology corporation in downtown Reno sitting innocently in the mailbox mixed with the usual stack of overdue bills. I stood in the driveway with trembling hands as I carefully tore open the seal to reveal an acceptance letter for a paid internship in their systems analysis department. The salary offered in the document was more than double what I currently made at the warehouse, and it included a pathway to a full-time engineering career upon graduation. I felt a wave of pure euphoria wash over me for the first time in years, because this was finally my golden ticket out of poverty. I walked through the front door with a genuine smile that I failed to suppress, which turned out to be a tactical error on my part. Jada was waiting in the kitchen like a predator who sensed a shift in the power dynamic, and she snatched the paper from my hand before I could even set my keys on the counter. Her eyes scanned the document rapidly while her expression shifted from curiosity to a twisted form of jealousy that distorted her features. She did not offer a word of congratulations or a hug for her younger sister, but instead looked at me with cold contempt as she deliberately tore the letter into two perfect halves. She dropped the pieces onto the dirty linoleum floor and dusted her hands off as if she had just disposed of trash. The ultimatum she delivered next was so audacious that it took my brain a full minute to process the sheer entitlement dripping from her words. Jada announced that I was required to withdraw from my college courses immediately and quit my warehouse job so I could stay home to manage the household. She claimed that with the sixth baby coming, she and Derek needed to focus all their energy on finding suitable employment, which was a lie everyone knew they would never fulfill. Derek was sitting at the kitchen table nursing a soda, and he chimed in with a smirk that made my skin crawl. He laughed at the idea of me working in an office and told me that a woman's place was in the home taking care of the family rather than chasing foolish career dreams. The disrespect in that room was so thick I could taste it, but I refused to let them see me cry over the torn paper. I bent down to pick up the scraps of my future while Jada stepped closer to intimidate me with her physical presence. The air crackled with hostility as she realized I was not going to submit to her demands this time. Jada screamed at the top of her lungs so loud that the neighbors probably heard her through the walls. "You think you are going somewhere? You owe me this house. I need you here to watch the kids so I can rest. If you walk out that door, do not ever come back." I stood up slowly and smoothed out the wrinkled paper in my hand while channeling every ounce of indifference I had left. I looked at the woman who shared my DNA but possessed none of my values, and delivered the truth she was not ready to hear. I cold looked straight into her eyes and said, "You are right, Jada. I will go. And you will soon realize the price of turning the only person helping you into an enemy." I turned my back on her to walk toward my bedroom, but Derek decided he needed to have the last word to soothe his fragile ego. Derek chuckled darkly and called out, "Come on, little girl, you will not last a week out there. You will eventually crawl back to apologize to us." I closed my bedroom door and locked it. But I did not start packing immediately because I knew they were listening for the sound of zippers or boxes. I waited until the house settled into a deceptive quiet before slipping out to the garage under the pretense of checking the laundry. The garage was dimly lit and smelled of oil, but it was the only sanctuary I had left in that suffocating property. I was startled when a shadow moved near the workbench, but I relaxed when I saw Justin stepping out from behind a stack of old tires. My 16-year-old nephew looked older than his years, with dark circles under his eyes and a grim expression on his face. He walked over to me silently and pressed a small battered notebook into my hands. I opened it to see pages of handwritten notes detailing dates and times when he had overheard Jada and Grandma Lorraine discussing plans to sabotage my financial independence. Justin told me that they planned to report my car as stolen if I tried to leave with it, and that I needed to get out tonight before they woke up. I looked at this brave young man who was sacrificing his own safety to protect me and realized that leaving was the only way I could ever become strong enough to come back and save him. At 12 o'clock that night, when darkness covered the entire suburban neighborhood of Reno, I initiated the final phase of my departure with the precision of a calculated military operation. I moved through my bedroom with the silence of a ghost because I knew that a single creaking floorboard could wake the light sleepers down the hall and ruin my chance at freedom. I bypassed my collection of sentimental trinkets and photo albums because I understood that emotional attachments were heavy anchors that would only drag me back into this toxic environment. I focused strictly on survival essentials by placing my laptop, birth certificate, social security card, and a week's worth of clothing into heavy-duty black trash bags. This was a strategic choice to ensure that if Jada or Derek happened to look out the window, they would simply think I was taking out the garbage rather than moving my entire life out of their house. I crept down the hallway past the master bedroom, where the faint sound of Derek's snoring vibrated through the door like the growl of a sleeping guard dog. My heart hammered against my ribs with such intensity that I was terrified the sound alone would wake the baby sleeping in the nursery. I reached the kitchen door and found Justin waiting for me in the shadows. Just as he had promised earlier that evening in the garage, he did not say a word as he grabbed two of the heaviest bags from my hands and led the way to my sedan parked on the street to avoid the noise of the garage door opener. We loaded the trunk in absolute silence under the dim amber glow of the street lights while the cold Nevada wind bit at our exposed skin. I turned to look at my nephew one last time and felt a crushing weight of guilt settle in my chest because I was leaving him behind to be the responsible adult in a house full of children. Justin stood there shivering in his thin hoodie with his hands shoved deep into his pockets while he tried desperately to maintain a brave face. He looked at the house that was more of a prison than a home and then turned his gaze back to me with a maturity that no 16-year-old boy should ever have to possess. Justin stepped closer and whispered urgency into the cold night air. "Auntie, go. Don't worry about us. If you stay here, you will die a slow death inside these walls. I will send you a message if anything bad happens." I reached out and grabbed his hands to squeeze them tightly because I needed him to know that this separation was a strategic retreat and not an abandonment. I looked him in the eye and said, I promise I will come back to get you and the kids when I am strong enough. But right now, I have to save myself first, so I can save you later." He nodded once and pushed me gently toward the driver's seat before turning back to the dark house to resume his watch. I started the car and allowed it to roll down the hill in neutral, before engaging the engine to ensure the noise did not travel back to the driveway. I drove through the deserted streets of Reno with tears streaming down my face, but with a sense of relief so profound that it made me lightheaded. I drove for 40 minutes to the other side of the city, to a dilapidated apartment complex that Tesser had managed to secure for me just hours before. The studio apartment was located above a noisy laundromat and smelled faintly of old cigarettes. But to me, it smelled like victory. I dragged my trash bags up the 3 flights of stairs and collapsed onto a bare mattress on the floor without even locking the deadbolt, because I was too exhausted to care. The peace I found in that empty room was shattered the moment the sun came up the next morning. I woke up not to the sound of screaming children or demanding adults, but to the relentless vibration of my cell phone dancing across the wooden floorboards. I picked it up to see 99 missed calls and hundreds of text messages from Jada that ranged from confused to apologetic, and finally to homicidal. The sheer volume of her rage confirmed that she had woken up expecting her morning coffee and unpaid nanny only to find an empty room and a cold stove. I ignored the calls and pressed play on the most recent voicemail she had left just 2 minutes ago. Jada's voice shrieked through the tiny speaker with enough venom to curdle milk. "You are an ungrateful brat. I will call the police and tell them you stole my money. You will pay for abandoning this family in our time of need." I listened to the threat with a calmness that surprised me, because for the first time in my life, I was not in the room with her to absorb the blow. I saved the voicemail as evidence and then blocked her number before getting up to start my first day as a free woman. I did not know yet that her threat about the police was not just an idle scream into the void, but a promise she actually intended to keep. Less than 48 hours after I started my new life at the rented apartment, the illusion of peace was violently shattered by a chaotic scene straight out of a crime drama. I was sitting on my bare mattress trying to focus on a textbook when the entire room was suddenly illuminated by the strobe light effect of red and blue sirens flashing through the thin blinds. The aggressive pounding on my front door shook the cheap frame so hard that flecks of paint fell onto the floorboards, and my heart immediately hammered against my ribs. I looked through the peephole to see 2 uniformed officers with their hands resting on their holsters, and standing right behind them was a woman who looked like a grieving widow. Jada had somehow convinced the police to let her accompany them to the scene of the alleged crime, and she was currently putting on the performance of a lifetime in the hallway of my building. I opened the door slowly with my hands visible because I know how quickly these situations could escalate when false accusations were involved. The older officer stepped forward into the threshold, while his partner blocked the exit to ensure I could not make a run for it. He looked at me with a stern expression that told me he had already heard a very convincing sob story before arriving at my address. He wasted no time in laying out the charges that had been filed against me just an hour ago at the precinct. The officer cleared his throat and spoke with a voice that demanded absolute compliance. "Ms. Miranda, we received a report asking for a welfare check on a minor and an allegation that you have stolen assets valued at $10,000. You have the right to remain silent, but I advise you to cooperate." I was stunned into silence for a moment because the accusation was so much worse than I had anticipated. Jada did not give me a chance to respond to the officer before she lunged forward from the hallway with tears streaming down her face. She pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed with such conviction that for a second I almost wondered if I had actually done something wrong. Jada wailed at the top of her lungs while the neighbors began to peek out of their doors. "Arrest her, she is a thief." She took all the money I saved for my children, and she stole Grandma Lorene's vintage diamond jewelry before she ran away. I took a deep breath to steady my shaking hands and stepped back to allow the officers to see the entirety of my studio apartment. The room was almost completely empty save for my mattress and the trash bags containing my clothes, which clearly did not look like the horror of a master jewel thief. I invited them to search my belongings because I had absolutely nothing to hide, and I knew that my innocence was the only weapon I had left. The officers began to rifle through my meager possessions, while Jada stood in the doorway smiling smugly through her fake tears because she thought she had finally cornered me. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on until a breathless voice cut through the noise from the open hallway behind Jada. I looked up to see Justin standing there panting heavily with sweat dripping down his forehead as if he had run for miles to get here. He had likely hitchhiked or taken a desperate Uber right the moment he heard his mother call 911 because he refused to let me go down for a crime I did not commit. Jada spun around with wide eyes because she had not expected her son to follow her to my sanctuary. Justin walked right past his mother without looking at her and held up his cracked smartphone directly to the police officer's face. His hand was shaking, but his voice was firm as he delivered the evidence that would shatter Jada's narrative. Justin looked at the officer and said, "Mom is lying. Here's a video I recorded last night." Mom hid the jewelry box under her own bed to frame Aunt Miranda. The officer took the phone and pressed play on the video, which clearly showed Jada wrapping the velvet box in a towel and shoving it deep under her mattress while laughing about how she was going to ruin my life. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly as the realization hit the officers that they had been used as pawns in a family dispute. The younger officer stopped searching my bag and turned his gaze toward Jada, who was now backing away toward the stairs with a look of pure panic. The lead officer handed the phone back to Justin and turned to Jada with a completely different demeanor than when he walked in. He informed her that filing a false police report was a criminal offense and that wasting police resources on a personal vendetta would have severe legal consequences. Jada tried to stammer out an excuse, but her mask of the victim had completely slipped to reveal the vindictive narcissist underneath. She screamed that Justin was a traitor and tried to grab him, but the officer stepped in between them to protect the boy. I watched as the power dynamic flipped entirely, and Jada realized that her attempt to destroy me had just handed the authorities the perfect reason to investigate her instead. 2 months passed since the shameful incident at the police station turned my family's private dysfunction into a matter of public record. I had hoped that the humiliation of being caught lying to the authorities would force Jada to finally step up and become the mother her children deserved. However, without my paycheck to subsidize their lifestyle and my labor to maintain the household hygiene, the situation at my sister's house rapidly deteriorated from disorganized to dangerous. The police officer who had handled the false theft accusation filed a mandatory report with Child Protective Services because he was alarmed by Jada's unstable behavior and Justin's desperate video evidence. The investigation that followed peeled back the layers of neglect that I had been covering up for years. A caseworker arrived at the house for a surprise inspection and found conditions that were legally defined as uninhabitable for minors. There was black mold growing in the bathroom that no one had scrubbed in 8 weeks, and the refrigerator was completely empty except for a few condiments and expired milk. The electricity had finally been cut off again because Jada refused to use her own money to pay the bill I had settled months ago. The caseworker noted that the younger children, specifically Caleb and Leo, were showing signs of malnutrition and poor hygiene that could no longer be ignored. Derek proved exactly how much his loyalty was worth the moment the pressure from the government agencies became real. He realized that staying with Jada meant he might be held liable for child neglect or forced to pay for the mounting legal fees. He did not fight for his family or try to find a job to fix the mess he helped create. Instead, He waited until Jada was asleep one Tuesday night and quietly packed his bags. He raided the house for anything of value, including the small stash of cash Jada had hidden in a cookie jar, and vanished into the night without even leaving a note for the woman who had supported his laziness for years. Jada woke up the next morning to find herself completely alone in a crumbling house with 5 terrifyingly quiet children and a court summons taped to the door. The legal hammer came down swiftly and without mercy during the emergency hearing later that week. The judge looked at the photos of the living conditions and the report from the caseworker with a grim expression that sealed the fate of the Miller family. Jada stood there trembling, not with maternal concern, but with the terrifying realization that her safety net was gone. The caseworker delivered the verdict that shattered Jada's delusion of control. The CPS caseworker looked Jada in the eye and stated firmly, "Miss Jada, based on the sanitary conditions and your unstable psychological state, we are forced to execute an order to remove the children from this environment immediately," engaging the engine to ensure the noise did not travel back to the driveway. I drove through the deserted streets of Reno with tears streaming down my face, but with a sense of relief so profound that it made me lightheaded. I drove for 40 minutes to the other side of the city, to a dilapidated apartment complex that Tessa had managed to secure for me just hours before. The studio apartment was located above a noisy laundromat and smelled faintly of old cigarettes. But to me, it smelled like victory. I dragged my trash bags up the 3 flights of stairs and collapsed onto a bare mattress on the floor without even locking the deadbolt, because I was too exhausted to care. The peace I found in that empty room was shattered the moment the sun came up the next morning. I woke up not to the sound of screaming children or demanding adults, but to the relentless vibration of my cell phone dancing across the wooden floorboards.